All right, guys, welcome to period 6. I'm going to go over the beginning real quickly since we did this in class, and then the areas that we didn't go over in class we'll spend a little bit more time with. All right, so if we look at the key concepts, we went over those. Those are just good general ideas for you to know. All right, if we look at why the United States was an industrial power, we went over this in class. But remember, there's a number of unique advantages the United States has that leads to it being able to become an industrial power. So do you need to know every single one? Probably not. Do we need to have a general idea of the concepts? Yes, and laissez-faire is a term that you need to know and understand what that means. We'll get to that more later. All right, we know that Vanderbilt and the railroads was really, really important. We talked a lot about that. Talked about the development of Vanderbilt and his railroad monopoly and all the different things that leads to us, including time zones and the growth of American industry. Remember, like I said, American industry grows in the back of railroads. Railroads are the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Talked about Carnegie and Rockefeller a lot. Don't think we need to spend a lot more time on them. Again, good specific historical evidence if we're looking for anything that has to do with business. All right. Talked a lot about the antitrust movement. Take some time to examine these cartoons. They're all antitrust cartoons. They all should give us an idea of why and how people started to lampoon monopolies as being what we need for consumers, anti-consumer. It might be good for the big businesses, might be good for even the economy in general at times, not good for the workers, not good for the consumer. We went over this in class, but remember Adam Smith and the idea of the invisible hand of supply and demand is super, super important. We got to understand that. Okay, we know that then we get this competing argument between social Darwinism and the gospel of wealth. Social Darwinism, again, the idea that people are poor because they are not fit, they deserve to be poor, therefore the government or individuals really shouldn't do a heck of a lot to help them out. Gospel of wealth, God selected Carnegie to be wealthy, therefore he has a God-given responsibility to take care of those who are less fortunate than him. Competing ideas, social Darwinism, gospel of wealth, okay? Lots of different inventions. Again, do we need to know every invention? No. Can we know some inventors and their inventions to use specific historical evidence at different times in our essays? Yes. All right, probably the biggest overall theme that this slide has is the idea that we started consumer culture. Obviously, we have a consumer culture today. We talked about that in class. That kind of begins with the Gilded Age in earnest. All right, that leads to a greater inequality of wealth. We talked about that, where the rich control a large amount of the nation's population. All right, and then they also show that off. All right, a term for that is conspicuous consumption, a term we didn't use a lot in class. Conspicuous consumption, the idea that the rich are using up and showing off kind of all the different things that we have. So that's a good term to use. Again, might show up in a multiple choice test, might show up on a short answer question. Definitely would be good for specific historical evidence. All right. The idea of the American dream really comes from Horatio Alger, the myth that the poor can become rich. Now, is that a complete and utter myth? No, of course it's not. Andrew Carnegie was poor and became very, very wealthy, and that happens in American society. All right. However, it doesn't happen often, and that's why people will talk about the American dream as a myth sometimes. All right, we do get an expanding middle class because of this, though, and more Americans are going to work for wages. They're going to work to get paid just like most of us do today. All right, we don't own businesses, and we're working to get paid by somebody else. That becomes very, very common during the Gilded Age. All right. We know that we do get some working women, all right. A lot of them end up right away in clerical positions, the idea of bookkeepers, secretaries, telephone operators, that kind of stuff. Few of them work in factories, but not very much, all right. But as time goes on, and goes all the way till today, all right, jobs that are held by women stereotypically get paid less, and that starts during the Gilded Age, and it's continued all the way on till today. All right, what's the problem with factory work? There's not a lot of pride in factory work. It's very monotonous. It can be very, very dangerous. All right, we are going to get some people who just quit their job, and we are going to get some people who join unions, and we'll talk about that more as we move on here. All right, we talked a lot about the fact that people tend to move into cities. Lots of different reasons they move into cities, but the growth of cities is really important. All right. We also talked about the struggle of organized labor. Yes, some people are going to join unions, but for the most part, unions are very ineffective during the Gilded Age. When we get into the early 1900s and the Progressive Age, that's going to change. Again, a list of different things that were used by employers. We talked about these in class to help keep unions down. All right, but we are going to get some big unions. The National Labor Union is going to be the first attempt to really unionize a large amount of people. All right, following that's going to be the Knights of Labor. All right, these are going okay. However, labor violence is going to hurt this. And we talked about the Haymarket bombing a little bit, the idea that there was a bombing that killed police officers. Unions were blamed for the bombing. Whether or not they actually committed it is a point of argument. All right, but they were blamed for it. And the Knights of Labor is going to lose significant amount of members and popularity due to the Haymarket bombing. The American Federation of Labor is going to grow and end up, the AFL is going to end up being one of the biggest unions, if not the biggest union, leaving the 1800s, moving on into the 1900s. All right. Again, the big key to this slide, we talked about this slide as well in class, but the big key to this slide is the idea that every single time in the Gilded Age, or at least almost every single time, the government's going to come down on the side of the business owners. Strikes are not going to be effective, all right? And there's always going to be arrests, sometimes violence. Oftentimes troops are going to come in and they are going to take care of these strikes. But the government is going to side with the business owners. Now, that will change a little bit as we move into the 1900s, but at this point during the Gilded Age, important to keep in mind. All right. As we move to the West, we get the idea of the plains and what's going on out there. All right. We talked a lot about the bison herds being wiped out and the effect that's going to have on the Native Americans. All right. And both the human costs of deaths as white settlers move into Native American territory, and also the cultural costs. We'll talk about that with Dawes, the idea that there's going to be really a legitimate attempt to destroy the American Native Indian culture. All right. Homestead Act's really important, guys. Got to understand that whole idea of the Homestead Act, the 160 acres of land, what it's used for, and then the problems that it causes, both environmentally with dry farming and that kind of thing that we talked about, and as well as economically and the controversies that are going to go with the Homestead Act economically. Remember that during this time is when the official frontier is closed. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, there is no more frontier. There is no line between the United States and what lied beyond. It's all United States now. All right. Different lands that have been set aside for different people, whether it be the Native Americans, whether it be Hispanics who had controlled a lot of the land in the Southwest, are slowly going to be overtaken by the white worker. All right. Turner's frontier thesis is kind of important, especially when we look at the idea of conservation and the idea that the frontier and nature are important. All right. And he's going to really speak to that as we go on. All right, we talked a lot about Native Americans and the problems they faced during this time period. Some specifics on these last couple slides. Again, important to remember that we get the reservation policy that's going to take place. They're going to put on native reservations, the Great Sioux Reservation and the reservation in Oklahoma. And then over time, those are going to get taken away as well. And those reservations are going to shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink until they are what we have today. And we still have reservations today, very, very small, oftentimes in very, very poor areas of the country. All right. And the natives didn't just lay down and take this. They fought back numerous different wars and numerous laws to try to stop those wars that oftentimes were then overturned or ignored. All right, that's going to lead to American Indians to resist and new religious movements to come out. We talked about the Ghost Dance and how that led to Wounded Knee and the problems with that. A lot of this is going to lead to Helen Hunt, all right, and explaining the idea that we should have some sort of sympathy. Now, the interesting I guess, is that Helen Hunt's books, which were meant to create sympathy for the Native Americans and talk about how poorly they had been treated, oftentimes were used to show that the answer to this is to destroy their culture. I'm not sure that's exactly what Helen Hunt was going for, but that's the way it was taken, that we need to assimilate them into white culture. Yes, they've been treated poorly. Their culture is terrible, according to a lot of people at the time, and therefore, so we need to encourage them to join the white culture. That's going to lead to really U.S. policy for the next 50 years because we're going to get Dawes, and remember, Dawes is all about forced assimilation, whether it's forcing breaking up the Native American tribal lands into 160-acre plots to try to get them to farm like white people, whether it's taking their children and putting them in boarding schools, schools where they were learned forcefully white culture. They were oftentimes beaten for speaking their language or beaten for practicing their culture. But we're going to get forced assimilation and really an organized attempt to destroy American Indian culture, as terrible as that is during this time period. And that's really the way it's going to be up until the New Deal of FDR, as we kind of fight out of the Great Depression. Part of that is going to be allowing Native Americans to have some sort of recognition for their culture. Remember, there's also the Latinos out west, southwest. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about them in this unit, but know that they're out there and understand they face some of the same problems. All right, they claimed a lot of land out there. All right, but over time, as white settlers moved out there, oftentimes through legal procedures, which they may or may not have understood because they weren't part of the culture, they didn't really understand how the court systems worked. All right, they ended up losing a lot of their land, and that forced them into migrant workers. And we talked in class about how that's still the way it is for a number of Hispanics out west now. All right, with all this moving west and the taking of land, we are going to get a conservation movement. We're going to get a number of laws that are passed to try to preserve the beauty of nature, especially out west. All right, and that's really going to take off with Teddy Roosevelt when we get into the progressive era. All right, the South. All right, we know the South is not the same, okay? We're going to get the idea. There are some people who are going to believe in this New South idea, all right, really promoted by an Atlanta newspaper, the idea that the South should diversify its economy, that it should take on capitalism, that it should build factories, that kind of stuff, all right? And there are going to be some that are built, especially in cotton, especially textile factories, but in the long run, they're never really going to take off as far as industrialization. They're going to remain poorer than the North. They're going to remain, there are going to be more racial problems in the North. They're going to remain more agricultural than the North, all right? And they're just not going to be able to take over the way the North did. They're not going to industrialize the way the North did, all right? We know that farmers faced a number of different problems, all right, both in the North and the South. Now, we talked a little bit more about the North. We didn't talk a ton about the South. All right, they are going to try to diversify their planting at least. So at least they have a diversified agriculture, not all cotton. All right. We talked about sharecropping. You need to know what sharecropping is. All right, George Washington Carver is going to try to diversify the agriculture. He'll have a little bit of success. And we are going to start to get a Southern Farmers Alliance as well, and even a Colored Farmers Alliance, okay, all of which were attempting to protect the rights of farmers. All right, segregation, we talked a ton about the end of segregation, the election of 1876, the Compromise of 1877, and how the withdrawal of Northern troops from the South and basically the end of Reconstruction just devastated the opportunities for African Americans in the South to have rights. We talked about Plessy versus Ferguson, and we talked about the idea that really this is going to maintain African Americans in a subservient position all the way up into the Civil Rights Movement, and some people would argue even till today. All right, just some specifics on that: discrimination, the way they were kept from voting, and then the ways they responded to the segregation. They didn't just lay down and take it. There was a number of people who fought back against segregation, both by writing, campaigning against different things, and different people did different things in order to try to get better treatment for the blacks, from trying to get them to be able to move to Africa, to trying to get them to be better educated separately, to just arguing that equal rights mean equal rights and they should be treated just the same as the whites. So some specifics on this slide to give you some ideas of the way they responded. Just some good general information to know, and again, something we can use for specific historical evidence when we start to look at our essays. All right, again, I guess I got artistic here. All right. Now, farmers started to fight back, all right? The National Grange Movement was an attempt to join together to get better treatment for farmers and better deals for farmers. All right, that's really going to lead to the Interstate Commerce Act. Again, though, the Interstate Commerce Act is an attempt to regulate business. In the long run, it's not going to really help a whole heck of a lot, but it is going to set the stage for the progressive era, and that's why it's really important. Kind of similar with the Farmers Alliance. They're going to join together. They are going to get some concessions, all right, but they are just simply not going to get significant concessions really until the 1900s. All right, immigration is important to understand, all right, and really the difference between the old and the new immigrants. And we talked a little bit about this in class this week, not a ton, all right. There's a lot of specifics on this chart, on that slide, but this chart really sums it up. All right, I'd really kind of understand the differences between the old and the new immigrants and why that leads to more problems with the new immigrants. All right, the old immigrants, yes, there was problems. There was nativism. There was people who were against the old immigrants. But that tended to disappear very quickly as the old immigrants assimilated into white culture. All right, the new immigrants, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. We're not going to see the assimilation as quickly, and that's going to lead to more problems, which is why we're going to get some of the issues that we're going to get. They're going to carry into period 7 as we move on. Okay, talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. There are other laws that were put into place to try to limit what were considered to be undesirable immigration. Now, interestingly, these were often supported by the workers, by the poor, by the labor unions. Logically, why would they support restrictions on immigration? Why would labor unions support restrictions on immigration? Obviously, because they were worried about their jobs. They did not want them to come in and take their jobs. All right, so we're going to get a kind of a weird combination of nativists, labor unions, all right, and social Darwinists, all who believe that we should restrict immigration. All right, still going to continue to get more and more immigration, and it's not really going to have a huge stopping of immigration, though we are going to get some. This is a great cartoon, Close the Gates, with immigration restriction, undesirable immigrants coming into the U.S. There seems to be some synthesis here towards building a wall. I'm not going to specify any particular politician right now, but I think we can definitely look at this and say synthesis. All right, you see the bomb instead of a head. They could be dangerous. There seems to be something to be said there for proposals to restrict all Muslims, as they might come in and dangerous. There's definitely synthesis in this cartoon to the presidential candidates today. Okay, again, same concept. All right, same concept. Keeping people out. Same concept. All right. All these other people can come in, but no Chinese. Right? Chinese Exclusion Act. All right. Politically, we talked a lot about the politics here. All right. We talked about the waving of the bloody shirt and the Republicans and how they get to continue to win over and over again. We get the Democrats and the solid South, okay? The Democrats are going to control the South. The South is always going to vote Democratic here for a little bit. It's called the solid South. Now, obviously, that's going to change because today the South very rarely, if ever, votes Democratic. All right, and we'll talk about as we get into the early 1900s how that happens, okay? Again, lots of corruption. The idea is simply to win elections, not necessarily to do what's best for the country. This is the Gilded Age is often considered a very low point in American politics. We looked at this actually during the year and understanding what mugwump is. Okay, we talked about Hayes, talked about the election of 1876. That's an important election because it led to the Compromise of 1877. All right. Again, all kinds of ideas here that are specifics. A lot of these are going to be repeats from what we talked about in class. Some of them may give you a little bit more specifics on here, but feel free to go through the different presidents and kind of what they did. Congressional leaders, Sherman Trust Act is really, really big. Again, not going to be really effective. The Antitrust Act, not going to be real effective early, will be very effective as we move on. More presidents, assassins, all kinds of fun stuff. All right, we talked about the Pendleton Act. We talked about the idea that there are going to be attempts to reform politics. All right, and we're getting the beginning of a very hotly debated issue. All right, should the United States stay on the gold standard? Should we create more money? how should we deal with our money supply? We're actually going to get a group that's going to be against removal of any old paper money. That would also create more money. We're going to get demands for silver. That's going to continue on. And we also talked about the tariff issue and how tariffs are so high we actually have too much money and what to do with that. Talked about all that in class. Billion-dollar Congress, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in because we talked a lot about that and the rise of the Populist Party with the Farmers Alliance and the different elections. All right, we did a lot of talk about this during class. Again, if you need a review, here it is. All right, same thing with the Depression and the Panic of 1893. All right, all the problems that took place here, the tariffs, and trying to figure out what we should do with silver, that kind of stuff, and Coxey's army and its attempt to actually talk about the political system should help the poor, should help the unemployed. Like we talked about, for the most part, not so much. All right, but when we get into the New Deal, a lot of the ideas of this time period are going to flash back into the New Deal, or flash forward, I guess, into the New Deal. All right, as we get to the election of 1896, that's kind of where we leave off in this period, and McKinley. All right, there's a little bit on here. I don't think any of this is going to show up in our next test. This is kind of the borderline between period 6 and period 7, and I usually talk a little bit about Bryan in period 7, but there's just a little, you can read this just to kind of sum up the what's going on, and a lot of the political arguments lead us to here. All right, so just a little bit of review for you, something you can go over for our test. All right, and remember, if we don't have the snow come, we don't get the snow day, we're looking at this test on Wednesday and Thursday this week. If we do get snow days, it'll change like we talked about in class. Good luck, and don't forget to work on that DBQ and look at how to write a good DBQ.